What's up, everyone? It's Chris from Chris Beat Cancer, and today my guest on the podcast, and for those of you that are watching on YouTube, is Dan Buettner. Dan Buettner is an internationally recognized speaker, researcher, explorer, New York Times bestselling author, and National Geographic Fellow. Dan has discovered through multiple expeditions with teams of research scientists specializing in population studies the 5 places in the world with the healthiest, happiest, longest living people. And these regions are known as the blue zones. My fans, subscribers, listeners know that I talk about the blue zones often. It's one of my favorite books. And Dan has actually written 3 books based on this research. The first is The Blue Zones, Lessons for Living Longer from the People Who've Lived the Longest. His second book is Thrive, which is Finding Happiness the Blue Zones Way. And his newest book is The Blue Zones Solution, Eating and Living Like the World's Healthiest People. Dan also started Blue Zones projects in multiple cities across the U.S. where they took the world's best practices in longevity and put them into practical use in people's lives at the community level. And one noteworthy result of this ongoing project in 2009, Dan partnered with AARP, and they applied the principles of the Blue Zones to Albert Lea, Minnesota, and just had a huge response from the city. They successfully raised the life expectancy of the people of this city and lowered the healthcare costs of the city workers by 40%. So, I mean, just really cool stuff. Dan has been involved in a lot of really cool stuff, so I'm excited to talk to him. And he even holds 3 Guinness Book of World Record. He's a Guinness Book of World Record holder for distance cycling, and might be the only person to have cycled through the Sahara with no sunscreen. So we might talk about that too. He's also won an Emmy Award for television production. So pretty awesome bio. Dan, welcome.
It's good to be here. I'm kind of blown away. It sounds like somebody else.
Yeah, right. You're superhuman. So, okay, let's man, there's so many places I want to go with this, but I said it in your bio, but I'm a huge fan of the Blue Zones. Will you explain briefly what the Blue Zones is, what they are?
Well, it's really a project, a 10-year project that we did in collaboration with National Geographic. And the idea stems from a widely held assumption that only about 20% of how long you live is dictated by your genes. The other 80% is lifestyle and environment. So we reasoned if we could find areas where we know people were living verifiably longer, we could maybe reverse engineer what they're doing. And actually, finding these places is not the result of me striking off with my pith hat and khakis and going into the hinterlands, but rather it takes place on computers and working with demographers with census data. So we try to find areas where either the life expectancy is highest, the centenarian rate is highest, or they have the lowest rate of middle-age mortality. In other words, people are eluding the diseases that are foreshortening our lives, like heart disease, dementia, diabetes, and, as you well know, cancer. And so once you find these pockets, and that took about 3 years, then I assembled teams of experts to travel to these places to try to distill out what are the common denominators in areas where people are living a long time, and then to try to articulate them. And the result was Blue Zones. And actually, I try not to use the name just with places. It's more about an idea. It's more about a way of living and the wisdom of the collective of people who live the longest.
Because you don't have to live in those places. Right.
No,
Yeah.
the idea is portable.
Right. So what are you identified 9
Common,
commonalities, right?
yeah, yeah.
9 common factors. Can you touch on those briefly?
Yes. So in blue zones, people don't exercise in the way we think of exercise. And I know this sounds like a heresy, but you never see these people when they were young or middle aged running triathlons. Now, remember, these 5 blue zones, I should say, one is in the highlands of Sardinia. Another is on a remote island in the Aegean called Ikaria. Third is in Okinawa, longest lived women. Fourth is in the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica. And then the fifth is among the Seventh-day Adventists. So most of these places, people are moving naturally. Every time they go to work or a friend's house or out to eat, it occasions a walk. They don't have all the mechanical conveniences that have engineered physical activity out of our lives. They suffer from the same stresses that we do, but they just have sacred daily rituals to reverse the stress and inflammation. As you well know, that a lot of cancer grows out of chronic inflammation that either comes from bad food or being too stressed out. In blue zones, people pray and take naps, do happy hour, simple things, but they do it every day. They have vocabulary for purpose. When it comes to food, they're eating mostly a plant-based diet. I know that won't come to a shock to you, but they have strategies to keep from overeating. And then the foundation for this sort of blue zone pyramid is how they connect. They tend to belong to a faith-based community. It's not necessary, but we see it in blue zones. They make family first, and then finally they hang around with the right kind of people, which I think is actually the most important. Because when it comes to longevity, there's no real short-term fix. There's no pill, there's no supplement, there's no genetic intervention that we know of yet. But we do know that if you're hanging out with healthy friends, friends that are eating right and are engaged, those behaviors are contagious. And when you want to think of strategies to actually live longer, you want to think of long-term strategies. And diets and exercise programs and supplements, we usually don't stick with those long enough.
I've heard you mention in a talk that most people within 3 years, was it 90% of diets and exercise programs and even supplement taking fail, right?
Yeah.
They stop, right? Whatever someone started, 90% of those people have stopped that healthy practice in 3 years.
Yeah, so I guarantee you can go out and Google. You will not find a diet in the history of the world that works for more than 5% of the people after 2 years. They sell a lot of books and they sell weight loss programs and they work for maybe 6 or 7 months. But longevity is the result of doing the right things for not just a few months or a few years, but for decades. Longevity, the recidivism curves of diets, again, 3 months, people will stick with it. It drops way off after 7 months. And then by the time you get out here to 2 years, right around here, 2 or 3% of people are still on them. So you have to look for strategies that are long-term if you really want to live longer.
Yeah, it's the big picture. It's the total lifestyle and not just the diet. But I would like to ask you, I want to talk about the Seventh-day Adventists because a lot of my listeners are American, right? And I think the ones that are not familiar with the Blue Zones would be surprised to know that the Seventh-day Adventists average lifespan is about 10 years longer than the average American. Is that correct?
Well, to put a finer point, it's only Adventists who adhere to, who really, because it's just like Catholics or Jewish people. There's different various levels of commitment, but the most committed Adventists, their life expectancy is about 10 years longer than
Loma Linda.
The highest percentage of Adventists are in Loma, or the highest concentration, but there are Adventists throughout America. And indeed throughout the world. There's about 16 million Adventists throughout the world.
Yeah.
And no matter where, as long as you're a committed Adventist, you get the effect. We just chose to profile for National Geographic's Loma Linda because there's a lot of Adventists there.
Right. And there's a multi-generational study there, right? The Adventist Health Study that's churned out a lot of data about their diet and lifestyle habits and their disease rates too, right?
Yeah, so they followed about 100,000 people over a 30-year period, and they found that Adventists who eat meat, they have the shortest life expectancy. Those who eat eggs and cheese, they have the second lowest. And then those Adventists who are either pescatarian, which means they eat less than one serving of fish per day, and those Adventists who are vegan, they're the ones living the longest. Of course, a lot of vegans out there are not eating animal products for environmental cruelty reasons, and that would sort of argue against the pescatarian diet.
Yeah, and I understand the ethical vegan versus the nutritional vegan. Sometimes people are vegan for both reasons.
Yes.
So, it's interesting because there's so much information now. I mean, every day, dozens, if not maybe hundreds of new health articles are posted on the internet, right? Because there's thousands of blogs on health and nutrition now. And of course, there are thousands of books that have been published over decades on health and nutrition. And it's very easy to get seduced by the latest health fad. And especially when, as Dr. McDougall would put it, people give you good news about your bad habits.
Yeah, right.
I guess the expression is people love to hear good news about their bad habits. So, what I see all the time is I see people promoting, a low carbohydrate diet or a paleo diet. Eat tons of bacon, butter, and brie. Tons of meat. Don't eat beans, right? And nuts are of little value, and definitely don't eat grains. But when we look at the blue zones, when we look at all of these areas around the world and we look at their diets, do their diets line up with that advice or not?
Well, the diets throughout the blue zone areas vary a little bit, but I can tell you, first of all, these aren't fad diets. These people have been eating the same way for centuries or millennia. So they don't vary. In most of these blue zones, there's maybe 20 foods that are eaten all year long. That make up the vast majority of their diet. So for the blue zone solution, we did a meta-analysis of sorts. If you want to know what a 100-year-old ate to be 100, and I argue that you want to eat for outcome, not necessarily for promise. And so we know they're people who are living to 100 at the highest rate. And in order to find out what they eat, you can't just ask them, what did you have for lunch? Or what did you have last week? Because they don't remember. If I ask you, Chris, what did you have for lunch a week ago Tuesday? What would you tell me?
Well, I actually know the answer because I eat the same thing every day for breakfast and lunch. But if you ask me what I have for dinner, I would.
Well, most people can't. But anyway, so the way we kind of piece together the centenarian diet in all 5 blue zones, we went and found dietary surveys done in the 20s and the 40s and the 50s and 70s. And first of all, you see that the eating trends were remarkably consistent throughout the century. And secondly, you see that 90 to 100% of their dietary intake comes from plants. It's a very high carbohydrate diet.
Yeah.
Now, when you say that, you have to qualify it in that, because both lollipops and lentils are carbohydrates, but so as you might imagine, they're complex carbohydrates.
Yeah.
About 65% of their dietary intake comes from things like whole grains. You hear wheat belly and all. In 3 of the blue zones, they're eating bread all the time, but it's usually 100% whole grain.
Yeah.
Surprise, surprise. Or sourdough, which metabolically is very different than just a plain old white bread. A real sourdough leavened with lactobacillus. Sweet potatoes, cornerstone of the Okinawan longevity diet. And greens, which in one of our blue zones, Ikaria was most highly correlated with low mortality. So they have 70 or so kinds of greens, most of which look like weeds that grow on the side of the highway, but they bake them into these delicious pies. But the cornerstone of every longevity diet in the world, and what shocked me was people are eating about a cup of beans a day. All kinds of beans, black beans, soybeans. No matter where you go and people are living a long time, they're adding about a cup of beans to their daily diet. And I argue that if you feel the need to go out and buy a longevity supplement, go buy a 2-pound bag of black beans, and it's about the best you can do. It's got the best research, and add that to your diet, and it should add a few years of life expectancy.
I love it. Now, I love beans. We eat beans and lentils, rice, quinoa, tons of fruits and vegetables every day in our house. Like, we love those foods. And so here's a really specific question that I'm hoping you might know the answer to. But in the, really, I'd say uber nerdy health community, there's debate on whether or not you need to sprout your beans. What have you seen in the blue zones? Are they all eating sprouted beans, or are they just eating regular cooked beans?
Well, I think you need four things if you want to use diet to contribute to your health. Number one, you have to be convinced that it's good for you. So whether it's sprouted or unsprouted, if you're convinced that sprouted is better for you, you should go for sprouted. Number two, you have to have the skills to know how to make it. And not, when I say skills, actually the time as well, because people are busy. Number three, you have to know you like it. So sprouted beans may or may not be a little healthier for you, but if you don't like sprouted beans, I guarantee you after a year you won't be eating it. You might sort of buck up and eat them for a while, but if it's drudgery to eat sprouted beans every day, you're not going to do it for a long time, so it's not going to matter. And then fourth, you need a community around yourself that reinforces those eating. So if sprouted beans are the healthiest thing in the world and all your friends eat barbecue, guess what you're not going to be eating when you go over to their house? So, so I would say find a bean you love to eat, learn how to make a few dishes that taste delicious, and stick with that.
That's great. That's great advice. We had black bean tacos last night.
You get a Blue Zone star for that.
Yes. Love some black beans and lentils especially. Okay, so plant-based diet, that's pretty important. Beans and grains are wonderful. Fruits and vegetables are wonderful. These communities also, and you mentioned exercise, and the main reason they're getting more exercise, is it not because, or isn't it because they do a lot more walking and bike riding than we do, because we're in cars, buses, planes, and trains?
So I like to be slightly disruptive when it comes to physical activity and say that exercise in this country has been an unmitigated public health failure. So fewer than 20% of Americans get enough exercise. We burn fewer than 100 calories a day engaged in exercise. Mm-hmm. But yet we keep promoting it, like gym memberships and fun runs and triathletes and magazine articles. It's not working. In blue zones, people are nudged into movement about every 20 minutes, and that's because their environment is set up in the right way. As I said before, every trip occasions a walk. They tend to have gardens. Big fan of gardens, because once you plant that seed, for the next 4 months, and in places where you can have several growing seasons, it could be 12 months, you're nudged to weed or water or harvest or till the land. It's that kind of gentle, low-intensity physical activity that's done every day that makes the big difference over time. Their houses aren't full of the conveniences that our houses are. They, of course, I'm sure if they had the opportunity to buy the electronic gadgets and the mechanized conveniences, they'd have them, but they haven't done it yet. So as a result, they get 200 to 300 more calories of exercise every day. They burn 200 or 300 more calories. Their metabolism stays at a higher rate because they're moving all the time. But they never go to the gym, and none of this weekend warrior mentality that justifies a sedentary week because they think they can make up for it, running 40 miles in the weekend. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I do go to the gym. I love going to the gym, but at the same time, can't argue with it. Like I totally get it, right? I get it.
So I should add that going to the gym isn't necessarily bad. Um, it's just that, and people like you who are disciplined and motivated, you've had cancer, and you're saying, there's no way in heck that I'm going to get this cancer, let this cancer come back. That's fine, but the reality is, for most Americans, it's not working for them. It works for a while, usually after the holidays, but then they run out of gas. So right now, I'm directing projects in 26 cities in America, and I'm charged with an intervention that's going to last a long time, that's going to really yield measurably healthier behaviors and indeed healthier outcomes. And uh, exercise is not one of the tools we use.
Which lifestyle practice, or if maybe it may be diet or community sport, gets the most bang for your buck?
Well, it depends the kind of bang you want. I would say you think of who your 5 best friends are. And we now know that if your best friends, even your 2 best friends, are obese and unhealthy, there's a 150% better chance that you'll be overweight yourself. We know that negativity is contagious, loneliness is contagious, alcohol use and abuse is contagious, smoking is contagious, junk food eating, sedentary, they're all contagious. So the most bang for your buck would be to assess your immediate social network. Are they people who sit on the couch and watch reruns of, Gossip Girls, or sit on the couch and eat chips and eat burgers? Or are they friends who idea of recreation is tennis or biking or walking or gardening? And are they engaged with the world? Are they generally positive people? Can you have a meaningful conversation with them? If you have a bad day, can you actually call them Chris and they'll care? Or are they like, Facebook friends who will move on to the next post if you're not, up and happy and have something to offer? So best bang for the buck for both health and happiness is to curate a group. I call it a moai. It's an Okinawan term, MOAI. A group of 4 or 5 people who have good habits to begin with, who are positive and who really care about you. And that, by the way, also requires you to follow suit and care about them and remember them and be there for them and to have good habits yourself.
Yeah, I feel like we're becoming increasingly more disconnected, even though we have this unprecedented amount of social network connection on the internet. We're more disconnected in terms of actual real relationships with,
Yeah.
like the Moai, like getting together with friends often and just being together, and family too, of course.
So the happiest Americans, and I know this from 2.5 million Gallup surveys, are having face-to-face time about 6 hours a day. So you want to engineer that into your life.
And that face-to-face time, does that include work?
If your FaceTime is with somebody with whom you can have a meaningful conversation, somebody you regard as a friend, it might not be your boss. It might not be, a coworker who's grumpy who you have to work with because they sit next to you, but it's got to be somebody you have an emotional connection with.
That makes a lot of sense. As from a guy who works out of his house.
Yeah, you should get out, Chris.
Yeah. I really do love being with family. I love being with people. Like, I really enjoy it. And so, man, I'm right there with you. So, okay. Question number 2 is, if you had to pick one of the blue zones to live in, just personally, Dan, what would be your favorite? Where would you want to live of all the places you've seen?
Well, I have a lot of friends in Ikaria, Greece. There's a place called Thea's Guest House, which is kind of ground zero. It's hard to get to, but it's right on the Aegean, and they serve Blue Zones food, and it's it's hard enough to get to that it hasn't been sort of modernized. Second one, I'd say Nicoya Peninsula. A lot of people, you can drive there from America, and it's a long drive, but you can drive. and it's beautiful. It's cheap. It's you have beaches, fresh fruit everywhere. Place called Nocera that a lot of people know about, kind of a yoga mecca. It's, I think, blue zones and yoga are kind of thematically linked, but you can kind of get both in one destination.
Yeah, that's great. I've been wanting to visit Ikaria since I read. I'm not sure what I read first. I don't know if I read the Blue Zones first or if I read your article, "The People Who Forgot to Die." Is that what it was?
Yeah, the island where people forget to die.
Yeah, which is a huge. I mean, I know massive article. Was that in Time?
The New York Times Magazine.
Yeah, New York Times Magazine. Got it. Sorry, our connection's a little weird, but I think it'll be fine.
People say that about me all the time.
Yes, figuratively. Okay, that's great. So the Blue Zone Solution, I really love that book because it's neat to see the just the pie charts of, you know, macronutrient ratios that people eat. Like I just geek out about that kind of stuff, right? Because I'm curious. I want to know, like, the ratios of carbs and fat that healthy, long living people eat. And I know it doesn't have to be precise, but being a health blogger and being a guy whose goal is to live a really long life and die in my sleep, I want to imitate the people who are doing that, right?
Yeah.
Like,
So I'll give you three general rules because people don't remember nutrient proportions
right.
for long enough. First of all, they're eating a cup of beans a day. So if you're eating that cup of beans, you're pushing out other unhealthier proteins. Uh, Number two, there's no cow's dairy of any kind in any of the blue zones or any beef. They eat meat on the average of 5 times a month. So if you need to eat meat once a week, it's probably not going to kill you. It's like radiation.
When you say meat, does that include fish, or are you not including fish in your definition of meat?
Most of the time in blue zones, they are eating a little bit of pork.
Okay.
Um,
So,
except yeah, except for the Adventist. Fish is up to, on average, 2 to 3 times a week, and they're very small portions.
okay.
And we don't know if they live a long time because of those animal products or in spite of the animal products. They quite honestly probably needed the calories, and they might even be healthier if they got the calories from plant-based sources, but they might not have had access to the plant-based sources. Again, I'm tracking from the Adventists who are living the longest time with no animal products.
Yeah.
So, just to be clear on that.
Well, and by the way, there is an interesting study that I'll try to find and link to that where they found that people in their later years, I believe, over age 80, actually had better life expectancy if they ate a little meat.
Well, older people have a harder time absorbing protein, so they have to eat more of it.
Yeah.
But I think probably the study was a little biased in that people's definition of protein until very recently was always meat or cheese, and there are other better sources of protein. Dollar for dollar, you get way more protein in beans than you do in beef, for example.
Oh,
So
yeah. You mentioned cow's milk. So cow's milk is basically, it's just not on the menu, but there's a fair amount of goat's milk, I assume.
well, in Ikaria, the Greece, and Sardinia, they'll drink some goat's milk. I mean, so the blue zones tended to be very sparsely populated areas. The terrain was dry and prickly. You couldn't really grow crops in it. So let's face it, people had to survive. And if you have a goat herd, they could get enough calories from this terrain, and then these people, they had to eat. So um, they were drinking goat's milk to supplement what they grew in their own gardens. But again, we don't know if goat's milk is helping them live longer or just gave them necessary calories to live that they might have gotten better in our modern world elsewhere from plant sources. I don't know. But you certainly can't recommend goat milk. You can say goat's milk was included in some longevity diets. But again, much more persuasive, whole grains and beans. That you can say, I believe, without a shadow of a doubt, if you're eating those with regularity, um, they're uh, they're will contribute to a longer, healthier life. In closing, let me just say that in blue zones, where you see these 100-year-olds water skiing and standing on their head and still working actively and playing music, none of these guys ever said at age 30 or 40 or 50 after whatever epiphany, well, go darn it, I'm going to get healthy and I'm going to start eating that longevity diet. They never said, I'm going to sign up for that gym or get them trained for a triathlon. They never called that 800 number for a supplement. They lived in environments where they were nudged into physical activity, subtle, low-intensity physical activity all day long. They lived in places where fruits and vegetables were the cheapest and most accessible. Their kitchens were set up where it's easy to make those fruits and vegetables. They knew time-honored recipes to make those taste good. Very important. It's got to taste good. And they cultivated, or they were born into a social network where that was made easy. And when we're working in cities trying to make them healthier, we're working with city government to change policies so that walking and eating fruits and vegetables are cheapest and most accessible. We're going into every grocery store, restaurant, school, workplace, and changing their policies and tweaking their design so people are nudged into moving more, eating less, eating more vegetables, socializing more, having that sense of purpose, and working with a critical mass of individuals, maybe 15 to 20%, to give them a checklist to design their own homes so they're eating less and moving more, augmenting their social network, and knowing what they're good at and what they have to give, and making sure there's a volunteer outlet for them. And when you put all that together and you orchestrate that perfect storm of a better environment, we see obesity drop double digits. We see diabetes start to drop. We see that populations start reporting higher levels of happiness. And to the extent we can do that as individuals, that's where the true secret of longevity comes in.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dan. Where can people find you?
Bluezones.com, or Facebook Blue Zones, or Twitter Blue Zones. I personally monitor it all the time. The best bean recipes in the world are free at bluezones.com. I want to be immortalized as the guy who made beans cool.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you, man. And in a culture that is currently demonizing beans and grains, we're trying to bring them back. So, all right, here's the official plug right here, guys. Look, here it is. Blue Zone Solutions.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, great book. Like, seriously, go buy the book. It's awesome. I love it. And everyone listening should read it. It will give you so much clarity and really a global perspective on health. And that's what's so important, because it's so easy to get tangled up and sucked into the latest fad that sounds good that really doesn't have any basis in reality.
I made sure to dot all the I's with little hearts, so chicks really love it too. No, seriously, it was spent 6 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, and I think it hit a chord. Part of it is how we found these blue zones, but at least half of it is how you put these ideas to work in your life, which at the end of the day, that's where the rubber hits the road. And I will say, I have an enormous admiration for you, Chris, for taking a personal epiphany, which you could have just held in and went on to live your life, but instead you're dedicating so much of your time and intellectual energy and really heart to evangelize what I believe is a message that is going to relieve a lot of suffering down the road. And I'm very happy to be among the hallowed group of experts that you have harnessed to really help people. So I salute you.
Thank you, Dan. Well, it's a mutual admiration society here. So
All right,
I'm
brother.
super happy to be on the same team as you, spreading the message of health. And just got, helping point people in the right direction, and hopefully they buy your book, they adopt the principles, and they spread the word.
I just hope they eat beans.
Yes, just eat beans, right?
Let's stay in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dan. Have a great day.
Bye.